Good afternoon. As our final participants are logging in, I have a few technical issues to address. For the duration of the program, all participants will be in listen-only mode. We welcome questions and encourage everyone to ask them throughout the program. In order to do so, you'll need to use the Q&A widget, which is located in the bar below at the bottom of your screen. Double-click the widget, type in your question, and simply hit submit. Your question will not be seen by other attendees, and your identity will remain anonymous to the other participants. We will do our best to answer all of your questions, time permitting. Finally, the windows in front of you can be adjusted for size and location. Feel free to take a few seconds now to make each window your preferred size. With those details behind us, we'll begin our discussion for today, which we've chosen to call Stand Up, March Forward, Be Counted. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Quinn Barabanoff. I'm a partner in Steptoe's Washington office, and I specialize in class action defense and energy litigation. As many of you know, 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which elevated to constitutional status the principle that voting rights should not be denied on the basis of sex. On its face, the 19th Amendment represented the largest expansion of voting rights in US history, applying to between 26 and 30 million women. But as a practical matter, the amendment did not achieve its full promise by providing voting rights for women of color, and the relationship between the women's suffrage movement and race was at times deeply flawed. With us to talk about this complex history and the insights it provides for our upcoming election, our current challenges related to voting rights and racial justice, we have an amazing panel. Jessica Bennett is the editor-at-large covering gender and culture at the New York Times. She's the first person to hold that role as part of the Times' efforts to expand its coverage of gender issues. Selena Stewart is the Senior Director of Advocacy and Litigation at the League of Women Voters. In this role, she develops and implements strategies and policy positions around election reform and voting rights, and oversees voting rights litigation, including some she's working on with my Steptoe colleagues, and serves as the lead lobbyist and liaison with Congress and the administration. Sally Rush Wagner is a pioneer in the women's studies discipline who teaches in the honors program at Syracuse University. She is the editor of the Penguin Classics anthology entitled The Women's Suffrage Movement, which includes works by the known and unknown women who shaped the movement. So Jessica, the New York Times had extensive coverage of the suffrage centennial, and you were very involved in that. One article I really enjoyed was called "Suffrage Isn't Boring History. It's a Story of Political Geniuses." So the message, I take it, is that we should rethink the way we talk about the suffrage movement. Tell us about that.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So one of the things we really wanted to do with our project was tell the story of suffrage in a more complete way. I think that as the story many of us have learned goes, and as the story I learned growing up in school, it was essentially, the path to women's rights began in Seneca Falls in 1848, and it ended with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. We heard about figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were the leaders of the movement, and all women were given the right to vote. Yay, the end. And essentially, what we now know is that story is, wildly incomplete. which in some ways isn't a huge surprise. We know that women's history makes up just a fraction of history books, and it is often missing. And the stories of women of color are missing even more. So we wanted to begin by correcting a few of the misconceptions. I'll just go through a couple of them. So one, the language that we use, given the vote. In reality, the vote was won. It was hard-earned and hard-fought. It was certainly not given to women. The movement didn't begin in 1848, nor did it end in 1920. I didn't know this until a few years ago. I'm embarrassed to say, but I will own up to it because I think many people don't know it. Native women did not receive citizenship with voting rights until 1924. Black women, as you mentioned in your introduction, while they did possess suffrage on paper, could not freely exercise that vote until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Of course, we're still seeing voter suppression efforts today. And perhaps most importantly, it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who led this movement. It was women of color, African-American women, working class women, immigrant women, queer women. They may have not called themselves queer at the time, but they were. And so you mentioned the article that you read. The title of that piece was taken from a quote of a woman I interviewed who is a curator at the Smithsonian. And she curated a whole exhibit about suffrage. But she said, and I thought this really crystallized it perfectly, this is not a dowdy, boring history of nagging spinsters. She said it's an incredible history of revolution staged by political geniuses. And I just love that because this is an exciting story and should be taught in a way that's exciting. And it is so much more complex than many of us learned in school. And so what we wanted to do was reframe it in that light.
I did so very successfully, I think. Sally, Jessica alluded to the long road to suffrage. So as our resident historian, could you give us some context? None of the women who participated in the beginning of the movement were able to ever cast a ballot. Could you describe the roots of the movement and how its objectives and tactics evolved over time?
Well, women's rights existed on this land before white settler colonialists appeared. Women in the area where I am, Syracuse, New York, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, have had political voice for 1,000 years. So we need to push the framework way, way back. And I think women voted in the colonies. They lost it during the Revolution. And then women began really to organize with the female anti-slavery societies in the 1830s. They learn how to have conventions. They raise funds. They petition. They know how to assume leadership positions. They face down mobs. So by the time the Seneca Falls local convention happens in 1848, the women who organize it are seasoned abolitionists. They have been part of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wasn't, had also worked with petitions for a Married Woman's Property Act. In 1848, it was passed by New York State a month before the Seneca Falls Convention. So there's a lot of talk about women's rights before 1848. And in fact, there were talk about not just the vote. The vote really comes much later, because the background is that after the Revolution, the state constitutions adopt as common law the Blackstone Code, which said that when women married, they were dead in the law. They ceased to exist. The two shall become one, and the one is the man. And what did that mean in practice? Women had no right to their bodies. They had no right to their possessions. They had no right even to the children that they birthed. A husband could will away an unborn child. They had no rights, of course, politically. They couldn't sue or be sued, sit on juries, and they couldn't vote. It was illegal for them to do so. So 1848, we have the local convention, but the national movement for women's women's rights really begins in 1850. And for that decade, before the Civil War, the women are working on the issues that we still feel unresolved today. Equal pay for equal work, job equity all the way around, right to your body, right to be free from violence, you name it. It pretty much is there by 1850 to 1860. Civil War happens, the women stop their organizing for their rights and work to support the war only if it's fought to end slavery. Now, Lincoln at the time is saying it's being fought to preserve the Union. After the war, the abolitionists and the women's rights advocates come together. Now, informally, they've been working together during the 1850s. They support each other's issues, and there are many of them working, most of them, for both issues. So they formally come together in the American Equal Rights Society after the war to work for universal suffrage, the vote for everybody. Well, the so-called radical Republicans who are in charge of Congress say, can't do it. We can only give it to the vote to one, so we'll give it to African Americans. With the 14th Amendment, they make it clear that it's only men by putting male citizens in the Constitution. First time gender has been mentioned. So the women and their male allies split over this issue, and they organize into two separate groups. National Woman Suffrage Association working for a federal amendment, American working for the vote state by state. Jump to 1890, when the two groups merge. There's some questionable conditions under which it happens, because it really isn't a merger. It's a states' rights organization, adopts the policy and the work of the American, really, and works state by state. Then comes in the Congressional Union, part of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, but they split off into the Women's Party, and they push for a federal amendment, and they push the National American Woman Suffrage Association to also work for a federal amendment. And it doesn't end, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure, in 1920. But that's kind of the overview. It's complicated.
Right. And Selena, the League of Women's Voters celebrated its centennial this year. And just as a spoiler alert, this is not a coincidence. So how does the history of the League relate to the history of the 19th Amendment?
Yeah, I totally agree. Hi, everybody. I'm Selena. It's nice to, well, I can't see any of you, but for all of us to be in this virtual space together. But yeah, I think Sally's exactly right that it's complicated. The League was founded in 1920, in February 1920, just months before the 19th Amendment by American suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt, who was our founder. Miss Catt was obviously a complicated character. She was a political operative, and by modern standards, I think many people would say she was also a racist. While fighting for the 19th Amendment and lobbying senators, she famously claimed that white supremacy would be strengthened and not weakened by women's suffrage. And so these remarks are sometimes brushed over as like a sign of the times or political strategy. But in our view, and looking back, actions speak louder than words. In our organization, we have to recognize, and we have been coming to terms with the fact that we were not welcoming to women of color through most of our existence. Many women of color were part of our organization early on, but they were not members. They often had to sit, of course, in the back of any conventions that we were having, meetings that we were having, also in parades and protests that we were doing. Women of color were not often on the front lines. And so I think that's something that we grapple with, even today as we celebrate 100 years is, what is our contribution to the pitfalls of the 19th or the women's suffrage movement, and what role did the League play? And how do we want to do better, knowing that we want to be more diverse and inclusive moving forward. But I think the first part of doing that is exactly what we're doing now, which is confronting the shortfalls in an honest way, in a straightforward way, not hiding behind it or shying away from it, owning that history and saying, now, how do we use that to do better, to be a more inclusive league? So, celebrating our 100th anniversary was bittersweet because we know that it's been 100 years, a century long of fighting for something is incredible, right? That's beyond most people's lifetime. But we also have to, look at the fact that there are opportunities, and how do we use this brand that has millions of members now across the country? We're in every congressional district. We have 735 local leagues and then 50 state leagues in DC. So we have a huge reach. And so how do we use our power and leverage that in a way that's positive and inclusive going forward? So I think that's kind of how we fit into the movement, understanding that all of what Sally said is true. It's complicated. Sometimes it's really just not damn pretty, but, we own that and figure out how do we step into this moment better moving forward.
Right. So, and the traditional narrative of women's suffrage, as Jessica mentioned, has traditionally focused on the contributions of white middle-class women, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others. But the centennial has provided an opportunity to focus on the important and previously under-recognized contributions of women of color to the suffrage movement. And a lot of work is being done on that. Why don't, Jessica, do you want to talk about some of the work that's being done in connection with the New York Times efforts?
Yeah, sure. I think that more broadly, culturally, we're in a moment, and we're seeing a moment where there has been this realization that history has been framed a certain way, often by the people who wrote it, and often those were white men writing it. And so there are a lot of people and stories missing from every aspect of history as the way we learned it. And so often there are names that we simply didn't learn in school. So as we began on this project at the Times to figure out how we wanted to commemorate the centennial of suffrage and to figure out whose stories and whose names we wanted to highlight, we really wanted to focus on those who were overlooked in the original writing of history. So this was a really fun exercise in learning some of these stories. I got to write a piece about Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a child of former slaves who moved to Daytona, Florida, which was highly segregated, and started a school for African-American girls with $1.50, in her pocket. She became a local leader. That school today remains a college, and she spearheaded all of these voter registration efforts by riding her bicycle door to door and offering literacy trainings to help both African-American men and African-American women who were going to be granted the right be able to vote. I learned about Mabel Pinghua Lee, who Selena mentioned. There weren't always stories of women of color leading marches, but this woman, in fact, led a suffrage parade of 10,000 people, members of her Chinese community in New York City, in one of the biggest suffrage parades in U.S. history in 1912. And she rode atop a white horse. It was incredibly memorable. And then there were certain stories that I just loved for sort of their whimsical nature. Gail Laughlin. She was a gay woman who would go on to become the first woman from Maine to practice law. And at the time in the suffrage movement, she demanded that pockets be sewn into her dresses, which was a radical request at the time, but one that I really personally appreciate and thank her for. So, there are so many stories and so many names that we just simply didn't learn about. And there's like a cornucopia of stories that we may not even know yet.
Sally, you've done a lot of work on this issue too, and particularly as it relates, as you suggested earlier, to the contributions of Indigenous women and others.
Well, Imagine this. 1,000 years ago, women began choosing the chiefs, the representatives that would represent them. And they continue to do this today, an unbroken line of this. Women, the clan mothers, raise the boys. They know who would be the one who would step back and look for everybody's needs. That's the man they'll choose. That's the one they'll train up to become the new chief, because the clan mothers are responsible for the eyes and the ears of the people, while the chief is the voice. Now, the voice has to listen to the eyes and the ears, and so women hold the position of the chief. And they have 3 rules. The man cannot have committed a theft. He can't have ever stolen anything. He can't have committed a murder. If he is a soldier, a warrior, has to step down. It's a peace confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy. And he cannot have abused a woman. If it's ever found out that he's done this, his clan mother will remove him immediately. In the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she cuts off his horns. She knew this. The suffragists knew these women. This was the inspiration. These women who had no legal existence saw women who had political voice. In fact, they are the only ones who can remove a chief. It's their responsibility. Give him a warning if he gets off the path, bring him back. If he strays again, the clan mother gives him a second warning. The third time, she cuts off his horns. That's the way the system works. So the white women who had no right to their property saw women who controlled the economy through being the agriculturalists. They saw women who had the final decision in peace and war, who had the final decision over land, who had their own property. And my hunch is, and I found this in a number of other Native nations, that this was the norm before the white settler colonialists arrived.
So a long-standing tradition there. Moving forward a little bit in time, we all obviously recently, the loss of Justice Ginsburg generated a lot of coverage. And what struck me was in the retelling of her early career, of her career as a lawyer, there was a lot of discussion about the legal strategies that the women's movement of the 60s and 70s borrowed from Thurgood Marshall and others involved in the civil rights movement for racial justice. And that when I read about the suffrage centennial, going back to the political genius point, there were so many tactics that we consider now to be the norms of civil rights movements of all kinds that were first popularized by the suffragists. So, Sally, why don't you tell us about some of those?
Well, the National Women's Suffrage Association practiced nonviolent civil disobedience. It was against the law for women to vote. They voted. They broke the law. Susan B. Anthony's test case happens in 1872. Women have been doing this for 4 years before this. Hundreds of women across the country voted. And if they couldn't vote, if they weren't allowed to register to vote, they sued the registrars that denied them the right. Virginia Minor's husband, because she was a married woman, couldn't sue or be sued. Her husband takes her case all the way to the Supreme Court. 1875, Minor versus Happersett. And the Supreme Court, 9 white men, said, if there is one case that can be settled now and forever, it is that women do not have the right to practice or do not have the right to vote in the United States of America. So they changed tactics, but in the meantime, one of the things that they're doing is, remember the revolutionary phrase, no taxation without representation? Well, they said on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, they would refuse to pay their taxes. So they did a tax protest campaign. 1876, the centennial, July 4th, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage write a Declaration of Rights of Women because the original one didn't include them. So they ask for permission to present it. They're denied. Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Joslyn Gage make the presentation. And as Gage wrote in The History of Women's Suffrage, we did it not for the women of our time. We did it for the daughters of 1976, so they would know that their mothers of 1876 had impeached the government for its treatment of women. They protested at the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty 10 years later in 1886, calling it the greatest hypocrisy of the 19th century that liberty is represented as a woman in a country in which not a single woman has political liberty. Well, their tactics then become later picked up and in fact, in some ways increased by the Women's Party, Alice Paul's group, and they hold huge marches. They also chain themselves to the White House. They go on hunger strikes when they're arrested. They burn the president in effigy. So, these were not well-behaved women. That's why they made history.
And Jessica, is it fair to say these ladies were pretty media savvy as well? Do you
Yes.
want to
Oh my
talk a
gosh,
little?
it's incredible. They were marketing geniuses in a lot of ways. And they were media savvy amid the mainstream press completely diminishing and belittling them, including the New York Times, which was staunchly anti-suffrage. So I was going back through our archives and I pulled a few just to read you because they're, at this point in time, they're funny. I'm sure they weren't funny at the time. So this is how the New York Times referred to the suffragists. In 1853, they ran a story, the headline of which was "The Female Pests." In 1908, we decided to interview a bunch of men about women's right to vote. So the headline was "Leading Men on Women's Right to Vote." And in 1906, there's this article called "When Lovely Women Stoop to Politics." So, as we can see, they were pretty belittling of the women. These are all, I feel like, female pests. If I ever start a band, I may borrow that. But back to the suffragists, they came up with these really creative ways to market the movement. They handed out pamphlets in which they would rebut arguments against the vote so that they could always be prepared with sort of a backup to push back on any argument they might get. They started putting out their own newspapers. They started drawing their own cartoons, sort of saying like, well, if we can't get in the mainstream press, we'll do it on our own. They created what we now would call wearable fashion, sashes, pins, umbrellas. They sold things like tea sets and coffee to raise money. And they would stage these radical stunts. They would drop pamphlets out of a hot air balloon after the silent sentinels, who were the nonviolent protesters who picketed outside the White House for a number of years, and many of them ended up being arrested. They went on a 16-city tour in their prison garb to sort of highlight what they had been through. I'm from Washington State, Seattle area, so I grew up climbing Mount Rainier. Well, the suffragists, 69 of them, climbed to the top of Mount Rainier with a group of mountaineers, and they planted at the summit a "Votes for Women" banner. So I just love learning about some of these creative ways that they were doing this. And there were even cookbooks. So one of the arguments against suffrage at that time was that if women could vote, then like, how could they possibly be domestic? Like, it would strip women of their domestic skills. So the suffragists started writing cookbooks where they would contribute recipes, and then sort of like hidden within the recipes would be all of these pro-voting messages. And it was sort of like, look, we can still make a pie, but also we want the right to vote. And earlier, Sally before we got on the Zoom, Sally was mentioning songs. They created music. They created sheet music. They would sing songs. And the songs, I learned recently, grew out of them being told by police that they were prohibited from giving votes for women's speeches. And so they were like, all right, we won't speak, we will sing instead. So it's really fascinating. And I love seeing all these. And I will just leave you with a Valentine's Day card from 1900 that read, "The rose is red, the violet's blue. We want vote as well as you."
If I could add one more thing I forgot. Women ran for president on the Equal Rights Party ticket in 1872, 1884, and 1888.
And I just want to add one more tool that I think was really, really effective, and it kind of dovetails on what both Sally and Jennifer were talking about, which is that they used education. Education was a huge tool for them. If you think back to 1918 when the pandemic happened, and then the Roaring 20s came right after that, people had been inside kind of like we are right now and like bored to death. And so when the Roaring 20s came, all of these parties start happening. Like people were partying and out being social again. And many times, at least what I'm reading from leagues, is that they would go to these parties and the women would treat this as like a political event where they were talking to husbands and other wives to say, we need suffrage. Here's how we're going to get it. Or come to our meeting next week. We'll be talking about suffrage. And so taking just everyday events and using that as an opportunity to grow their membership, grow their message, and do advocacy, self-advocacy for themselves, I think that was really, really powerful. And for the league, the goal for Carrie Chapman Catt was to enfranchise 20 million women. And that probably doesn't seem like a lot, but at the time, there was only 39 million women in the country from that past census. And so that was a really bolsterous goal to say, I'm going to enfranchise and educate half of the women, white women in this country, to know what's on their ballot, be able to push back on candidates, and we come together and get the people who are going to help us towards suffrage in office and fighting and working on issues that are important to us. That's an incredible feat, I think, for women to do at that time, but to use education, something that wasn't accessible to everyone, and being really smart at parties or events and really using that to advocate and spread their message.
So that's a great transition, Selena, to the work that the League is doing today. You are on the front lines of voting rights. What does voting rights look like today? And is it still a women's issue?
Well, we're not having parties. But I think that we use a variety of tools nowadays. We are still doing education. Education is what I think the League, people come to the League most often for. Education about their ballot. We do public forums. For many years, we ran the debates. As people may remember, every time a debate happens, we get a million emails saying, why isn't the League doing this anymore? So that was a big part. But also advocacy. We have leagues that meet with more than 1,000 election officials a year. We're meeting and thousands of elected officials every year talking about what's important to us. We're an issue-based organization. And most recently, we have taken on litigation too. So this year, just during this election season, we have filed more than 50 election-related cases dealing with COVID, which is extraordinary because this time last year, I think it was like 19 cases. So our work has definitely proved to continue to be relevant. We're trying new tools and trying new things in order to forward this work. And I think that that's really, really important for women, because our organization is mostly women, to be taking this on and fighting in this way, which is not I don't know how to say this, not as common. One of the things we've noticed in our cases that, we have these big time lawyers, I'm sure Steptoe knows exactly what we're talking about, but we have these big time lawyers. We see my little gray haired ladies come in, they're just like, oh, this is going to be easy. And these little ladies like tear them apart, because they know so much about voting in that area and what the demographics and who's impacted. And so, we're really using the women of our organization, because our average member is 72, as weapons in our arsenal to fight back on voter suppression and all of these huge issues that still impact us today.
Well, so let me ask this question. I mean, some of your comments touch on, and this is a question for you and for Jessica. Again, it seems like there's an overlap between voting rights as they relate to women and race, at least on some of the issues that you're working on. How are you seeing the notion of women's rights and equality evolving over time? Jessica, do you want to start it?
Sure. I guess I would just say I do a lot of work with young women, and I did a big project last year where we profiled 18-year-old girls around the world. And I recently was part of a project where we were profiling teenage young Black women activists. And I think they have such a more complex understanding of what our rights consist of today than I did at their age. And they very much think about gender equality and women's equality as an intersectional issue that cannot be separated from issues of race or class or gender identity or ability. These things must intersect. And they talk about this really eloquently. And their feminism is an intersectional feminism. And I think that, I'm just so impressed by them and encouraged, because these are many of the young women who are voting for the first time in this election and who are out in the streets protesting. And I just, they, compared to when I came into my understanding of voting rights in this country and of women's issues, they are so far ahead of where I was at their age.
Oh my God, that's so true. I mean, if we think about the March for Our Lives movement, which is nearly completely led by young people in this country, it's just incredible the amount of work that they've been able to accomplish and movement on this issue and raising it to a national topic that, we all know that name now. But I think it's very similar for the League. The League is working to attract younger people. And I think part of that attraction has come from us being an organization that you can come and get plugged right in. It may be something like getting plugged into a voter registration drive, or, a forum, or being able to educate people on local elections or redistricting or reproductive rights. It could be a variety of things. But I think, so many young people have all of this passion and want to plug in. And so I'm happy that the League is one of those organizations that they can join and plug in nearly immediately when they join. But the face of women's suffrage, I think, is changing. I think initially when we thought about suffrage, we did think of white women. And I think now that picture is much different. You're going to see more women of color. You're going to see younger women. You're going to see intergenerational groups of people participating, because it's so important. And if we think about the role of women in families, whether it is a Black family, a Latinx family, et cetera, there's many women who lead those households. And so they're the decision makers. They're making decisions for their family, but also for their community. And so it's so important to make sure that those voices are involved. And I guess I'll just close with one of the things that we're doing to make sure that at the League we become more diverse is we, in every program, everything that we do at all levels of League, we're asking, who is impacted by what we're trying to accomplish? And are they at the table making decisions, not just as a listener, but are they at the table making decisions? Because they are in the best place to figure out what is needed for them and their community. And it's time for us to stand as allies, using our network, using our power, using our, whether that's financial power, academic power, whatever that power is, to help move this movement forward, understanding that now may not be the time for the League to lead in every space. Allyship becoming even more crucial in moving this movement forward and making sure that it is diverse, equitable, and inclusive.
Mm-hmm. You know, and that is so heartening about young people and about the work that the League is doing and the vision of who you listen to, who needs to be at the table. You know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So the need for that. But I think we need to also speak some truth in history about the suffrage movement. You're doing some compensatory work now to undo the damage that the suffrage movement did, especially toward the end. You know, it began with this African American and white women working together in the female anti-slavery societies, the abolition and the women's rights movement working together. And then that split when Stanton and Anthony need to be called out, as they were by their co-workers, for the racist statements they did, for aligning and taking money from a well-known racist. But the real problem begins after the merger in 1890. Increasingly, the suffrage movement, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, uses racism as policy. The argument they give is this: give women the vote because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. They're appealing to the South. They're using expediency. They know what they're doing. They know it's wrong, but they do it because they say, we have to win the South. Susan B. Anthony tries to explain this to Ida B. Wells. You know, I'm not a racist, she says, and she proves it by supporting Wells in various ways when she comes under attack. But Ida B. Wells says, you know, and she tried to explain to me using racism for winning the vote, couldn't quite go there. And the organization allowed the state auxiliaries, you know, as a states' rights organization. So the state auxiliaries were on their own to do what they wanted to do. And they were allowed to work for the vote for white women only if they wanted to, some did, to segregate. And the national organization practiced segregation. They wouldn't allow women with dark skin to attend the conventions. Susan B. Anthony asks Frederick Douglass not to attend. First convention he's ever missed in 1895 because it was meeting in the South. And they also allowed the states to work for the state auxiliaries, the state suffrage auxiliaries, to work for Jim Crow laws, voter suppression laws. Now, they could have made other allies rather than courting the racism of the Southern white male leaders. They could have made an alliance with African American men and immigrant men who could vote. They could have supported Ida B. Wells in her work to end lynching, and that would have saved the lives of how many African Americans. So at the same time that we acknowledge that, in the words of Matilda Jocelyn Gage, they went past an oligarchy of sex where men all ruled all women. And they pushed democracy that much further, but only in theory. In practice, African American women and men didn't really have the vote protected until the Voting Rights Act in the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Native American women, the ones who chose to take dual citizenship, and men didn't get citizenship until 1924. Some will only maintain their native citizenship, nation citizenship today. But those who choose dual citizenship didn't get it until then. And Asians didn't get the vote until citizenship acts in the 20th century. So I think democracy is not achieved, it's a process, and we're still in the process of achieving it and undoing some of the damage that the suffragists did in their work to get women in the Constitution as voters.
So we think about today, and it's impossible to forget or ignore that we have an election next week. And a woman of color, Kamala Harris, is the first woman of color on a national party, a major party's national ticket. And there are many other women running down ballot. Jessica, this is an issue that you've written about quite a bit, but can you talk about some of the unique challenges that women, and particularly women of color, face in terms of how they are perceived both by voters and the media, and what can be done to level that playing field?
Yeah. So this is always a question that I struggle with in sometimes answering, but also in writing about, because what the research shows is that the more we point out difference, such as gender or race, the more that voters, in fact, start to fixate on those things. But we are in a place right now, I was actually frantically Googling during the last question to try to find an article about Shirley Chisholm, because I thought of something I wanted to mention and I didn't find it. But the point is, the way that Shirley Chisholm was described when she was running for office, and the way that Geraldine Ferraro, when she became the first woman to be a running mate on a major party ticket in 1984, was questioned. If you recall, she was asked if she could make a blueberry muffin, to which she responded, great response, "I sure can you?" asking the journalist. That would not fly today, I don't think, fingers crossed. But there are plenty of ways that some of the gender and racial bias has become coded and gone a little bit underground. We had the most diverse candidate pool in history among the Democrats very recently, and we are left now with two white men running for president. And of course, Kamala Harris is facing the issue of both gender and race. She has both of these things to contend with. And so we see that women politicians, still face questions like, well, is she likable enough? Is she really electable? Is she, in Kamala Harris's case, too ambitious? Questions that we simply do not ask of men. And also, don't you want an ambitious person if they are potentially going to be running the country? I do. But back to my sort of tension here, I'm always torn about how much to sort of lean into and focus on these things, because the more we focus on them, are we actually just reinforcing our biases? But I think, one of the important things, and one of the ways that we've clearly made progress, is that we actually have the language to talk about this now. We know that these are biases. We know that sometimes we hold them without even being conscious of it. And we know that many of us, and not just men, still see leadership in male terms. But I think that it's really encouraging. There is power in numbers, and we not only have more women in Congress today than ever before, and more women of color, but there are record-breaking numbers of women who are continuing to run for elected office. And so the more women, take on those roles, the less we will talk about leadership in terms of female politicians and male politicians. And I hope we will see them as leaders.
So we're getting towards the end of our discussion today. So I just want to encourage our audience to submit questions if they have some. But I also wanted to kind of wrap us up. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, protests over racial justice, and an upcoming election. Why should we care about the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and what, if anything, does history teach us about the challenges that we're facing today? Selena, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, so I think if the country looks exactly like you would like it to, then perhaps voting is not as important. But if there are things in going on in politics that disturb you or concern you, then I think that in and of itself is a reason to vote. I think in the African American community, many times we understand and have for many decades understand that our vote doesn't represent just me. Like, it's not just a single voter. We're voting on behalf of people who may be under 18 in our family. We're voting for people who do not have access, whether it's their citizenship status or what have you. There may be issues that are important to vote on behalf of those, but there may also be people who are incarcerated who don't have the right to vote, who we're voting on behalf of. And so the vote is a powerful right that we have, all of us have. And I think that if we think of it as beyond ourselves and just checking a box and think of it on behalf of all of the people that are impacted by our vote, and especially our collective vote, that should be more than enough reason for us to stand up and make sure that we participate. And I think we already see that. 50 million people have voted in this election, which is almost double what we saw this last round. And so people are responding to something. It'll be interesting to see what exactly motivated people to turn out this year. But I think it's inspiring. I think it's hopeful that so many people are being shaken out of their chairs to participate this round.
So Sally, let me go to you next. Should we be celebrating this milestone, commemorating this milestone? How do we interact with this milestone?
I think commemoration is the appropriate thing. Celebration is if you have purity. We don't. So I think a couple things we can learn from it. And of course, we need to learn from our history or we're bound to repeat it. I think one of the things is we need to re-examine expediency. That idea that is endemic in our political system that, well, maybe I can't get the whole thing, so I'll go for part of it. So what happens in that, and what happened, I think, in the suffrage movement, is that white privileged women did get the right to vote, but women of color and men of color didn't with the 19th Amendment. So I think, rather than thinking about, okay, we're going to try to win the battle, but we're going to give up the fight for the war. I think we need to think about, if we throw anybody under the bus with expediency, what is the effect? The other thing is, I think that we need to really cultivate the indigenous way of thinking both and rather than either or. We tend to look at our historic figures as either they're awesome or they're tarnished. Well, the reality is we're both. All of us are both and. So I think that holding our foremothers and our forefathers, as we're now doing historically, the founding fathers, we're calling out their flaws. And I think there's something really healthy with that, because in calling out their flaws, we see the places where we need to change.
Jessica, do you have any final thoughts for us before we move to questions?
I guess just that, we've seen how fragile democracy is, and by what a, small margin the last election was decided. So this audience probably doesn't need to hear it, but I will not be taking my voting rights for granted this year.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. We actually have quite a few questions, so I'm going to ask a couple of them, and I will probably suggest who might answer, but if someone else wants to jump in or you feel like you're not the right person, feel free. But one of our questions came in from someone who actually read an article in today's New York Times that said that only 45% of single women, eligible women voters actually vote, as compared to 70% of married women with children. How do we change? What are your thoughts about this, and how do we change this so women use this hard-fought right?
Oof. I have to admit, I didn't read that article yet. So I'm curious if that data was coming from the last election or if that's projected to vote in this election. Because I certainly think there have been a lot of campaigns and voter registration efforts and so forth targeting single women and younger women in particular because they have so much power in this election. I think that, and I'm not sure if that, I'm guessing that single women means largely younger women as well. I think that a lot of people haven't realized that their rights were at, really up in the air or at stake. Even my generation, to some extent, we grew up assuming that we would always have these things that, I think our foremothers warned us. Were hard won. And yet it took until recent years for many of us to become active or to, take to the streets or to march. And so I hope that we will see a big turnout of single women as well as everyone else.
And I think part of that comes from oftentimes single moms or single people, they may be raising kids or maybe they're not raising kids, but the logistics of our election is sometimes a barrier. Tuesdays, during the hours of 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And sometimes in certain states, the line could be 4 or 5 hours long before you actually get an opportunity to vote. If you're working in a restaurant or working in retail, you can't take off 4 hours and you don't get paid to take off to go for election day. So I think when it's a single woman, especially if she has kids, that sometimes those just regular barriers that we don't think about are in fact barriers to participation, which is why absentee voting and the expansion of that has been so important this election, to make sure that you can't go stand in line on election day or you can't get off work. You have an opportunity to participate in this election by filling it out at home, dropping it in a ballot box at your convenience, or putting it in the mail if you have time.
That's such a good point.
So we're getting just excellent questions. Some of them are not so easy. Sally, I have a feeling this one's probably for you. One of our participants observed that you could say that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an incrementalist. And so how does that fit into some of your comments today, in the sense that many people view her victories, though they may have been partial, some of them as victories nonetheless. And so how does that fit into this conversation?
Well, I think there may be differences between how an individual functions and how a movement functions. I think that a movement really needs to examine what's the ultimate goal and work toward that. The way that Selena was talking about, the League really thinking about who is not at the table, that we need to think about and represent their interests. That's thinking in the long term. That's smart, indigenous inspired thinking. I think that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, she's an interesting case point because of her, thinking that the Roe v. Wade was too early, not thinking that the three-state strategy was right with the ERA. I think that is the kind of thinking that can come with that making incremental change. I don't know. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said you ask for the whole thing because then you're going to get something. But I think that holding out for the longer, bigger picture, that strategy may take longer, but it may get us further in the long run.
All right, here's another question that I got, and Selena, this might be for you because it may lead into some of the other things that you're working on. Should we have another amendment to the Constitution that more fully protects voting rights?
Beyond just women? Well, we certainly need to restore the Voting Rights Act. I think that was one of the most powerful pieces of legislation and laws that we had in place. But people often ask me this as as it relates to ERA, do we want to start over? And I'm like, hell no, we do not want to start over. There have been so many laws where there was a timeline put in place, because part of the reason why the ERA is a subject of contention is because it took longer than the timeline outlined. But when you look back in history, there are so many laws that took more, or amendments that took more time to ratify than what was outlined. And the timeline has never been an issue. And so I think that we need to peck at it one thing at a time. We need to keep pecking away at the ERA. We need to keep pecking away at laws like the VRA to make sure that's fully restored and that people have protections in this country. And I think that it's not good. I don't think that there's one law or one amendment that's going to like save the world. It's going to take a combination of laws and practices and policies in order to move us forward in that front.
All right, I got several, this will probably be our last question, but I got several questions about Amy Coney Barrett in all sorts of different directions. But one I think I'll pass on to you, Jessica, is, there was, what can we learn, or what can be said about the challenges that women in public life face with respect to motherhood, and comparing someone like Amy Coney Barrett to someone like Kamala Harris, who's mamala, remarried children by marriage, and how does that impact how women are perceived in the public sphere?
Oops, I muted because my dog just came in. That's a great question. I could not help but notice, as the person asking this question probably did, the number of times that it was referenced how family-oriented or how many children Amy Coney Barrett has. It was incessant. And I also noticed in Senator Harris's acceptance speech, the way that she talked about how important family is to her. Yes, mamala, she may not have biological children, but stepchildren, family surrounding her, all of which is fine and great. But to me, it seems like there still remains this expectation that women fill a nurturing role when we think about women leaders and women in leadership. And so for Amy Coney Barrett to have achieved this high power, well, she's not too harsh or too cold, because she has all these wonderful children. She's a mom. She is a caretaker. She's nurturing. And I have often thought to myself, I've often wondered whether speechwriters for politicians purposely invoke language around warmth and around motherhood, particularly when they're writing for female politicians, because it's still in many ways accepted, and it's not, the word should not be abnormal, but it is an aberration to see a woman leader who does not have a family.
All right. Well, some complicated issues we've talked through today. I want to thank you all. First of all, let me just note, Selena, that there's at least one person who texted me that their contribution is on the way to the league. And thank you for your good work in connection with voting rights. But I want to thank you all for joining this conversation today. I found it to be particularly meaningful in the context of the election and this very significant milestone. And I hope that all of our participants found it as valuable as I did. And so thank you very much to everyone who attended, and thank you most of all very much to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.